He had catalogued it under an unremarkable number and told everyone it was just another fragment, MA37. The label sat on the corner of a cream envelope that smelled faintly of dust and varnish, the kind of smell that belonged to other centuries and to other people's secrets. Ray had stared at that code for 4 years, letting its digits grow into a private rhythm, a string of characters that clattered in his mind like train wheels. He kept the envelope on the small kitchen counter next to Margaret's chipped mug and the chipped mortar of his battered coffee grinder. At night, when the flat went quiet and the fluorescent lamp buzzed above his desk, he would open the flap and press the tablet between his palms as if it were a sleeping thing that might twitch if mishandled. He would say, later, that the Codex had never really been opened in the museum sense. No glass case slid back, no curator announced its resting. The opening had been something quieter, almost shy, a movement of attention that began to decode itself the moment he read the 3rd line of glyphs and felt his own breath tighten. But there is a simpler truth too, one he could have written in an abstract if he wanted to please chimera-minded colleagues. MA37 did not read like a prayer or an inventory. It read like instructions. It read like a script meant to be performed by a living thing rather than recited. Before the deep dive, a brief note. If you want to stay for the whole story, subscribe to follow the investigation and hit the bell. There's a pinned link with a companion ebook that gathers the primary images and contextual notes. I put the careful disclaimers there. None of this is medical advice. These are narrative experiences and in-story claims. Results varied among those who tried the practices in our community. Check the pinned resources for safety guidance and references. Ray had been a linguist by trade and a compulsive decipherer by temperament. Languages were to him less systems than skins, layers to be peeled back and smelled. He had trained in a world that prized footnotes and elegant dismissals, where the safest sentence was the most cautious one. He taught comparative glyphology at a university that paid too little. He judged too loudly. Margaret had tolerated his eccentricities the way a lighthouse tolerates storms, because some lights are worth steadying. She braided his hair, short as it was for him now, into a single informal knot and argued in the mornings that sleep would save his life more effectively than the next sleepless epiphany. When he brought home reproductions of cenote maps or rubbings of stucco faces from a dealer in the market, she would roll her eyes, make a joke about his treasure hunts, and then, later that week, prod the coffee machine to get him through another night. MA37, however, had the stubbornness of a small, dangerous animal. It was an unlisted leaf from a codex the dealer called forbidden, because collectors used that adjective like a talisman, more to impress at salons than to conceal true peril. Ray's first scan of ME37 left him with a headache and a sense of wrongness he could not name. Glyphs that overlapped architecturally, lines of notation that corresponded neither to calendar systems nor to genealogical records. In high contrast against the parchment, one repeated pattern did not resemble the usual corn motifs or the star signs. It resembled a spiraled knot, a seed shape nested inside a ring, again and again, until the eye wanted to stop counting. "You think it's decorative?" said Anika, a younger colleague who had once graded his translations and later became a friend for reasons unexamined. She sipped Ray's bad office coffee and shuffled through his photocopies with an impatience that belonged to people who had not yet learned to revere obsession. Or is this a maker's mark? Has anyone checked provenance properly? Ray wanted to say that asking whether a symbol was decorative was like asking whether the ocean was wet. Instead, he said, "It's not decorative. It repeats like a refrain. It's performance notation. There are contextual markers that line up with breath and posture signs catalogued elsewhere." "You mean like ritual?" Anika asked. She kept her voice pitched at the safe, skeptical level. Roommates of doubt always did. "Ray, we publish papers, we map. We don't stage revivalist performances of codex fragments in the graduate common room." He laughed then, because he could not look at the glyphs without feeling a third presence, like a hand at the nape of his neck. "It's not revival," he said. "It's an encoding. And if it's encoding, if someone wrote it to be enacted, then it might have been meant to change whatever enacts it." They argued, in the way colleagues do, in terms of grants and ethics review boards and the small reputations that mattered when your name lived on citation lists. Ray listened, but he had a private vocabulary that others did not share. He felt the glyphs as pressure points, as if each mark contained a dormant instruction for the body to read. Academic life, with its careful unbeliefs and polite editorial rejections, sharpened Ray into a kind of academic nail, useful for anchoring arguments, dull in the margins. He published enough to keep the department's respect and not enough to be safe from ridicule. When a prestigious journal sent back his early mimeographed essay on notation and kinetic encoding in lowland codices with a politely worded rejection and a reviewer comment that read speculative, bordering on performative, he framed the letter and put it beneath a stack of maps. It became a secret trophy, proof that he had seen further than they allowed themselves to look. He kept ME37 on that counter, because secrets held warmth. It did something the human voice could not, like unhooking a memory and letting it air. Ray felt an impression of a place, hot irrigation rivulets against mud brick walls, the smell of wet clay, children shouting into a plaza. Except this place was not physically distant. It was, somehow, a layer beneath what he called seeing. A sequence of images came not as a film, but as insistence. A teacher touching a student's throat, a looped symbol etched in clay, the same spiral seed motif repeated on a belt and on a child's earring. This was what the Codex had been referencing. Practice as transmission, passing a pattern through skin rather than script. He reached out, gravely patient, and touched the strip. The moment his fingertips made contact, the strip responded as if it contained a will. Light like stored incense moved under the surface. Ray's chest unclenched with a sound like a door whose latch had been lifted. He heard, inside his head, soft and precise, a thought that was not his. We saved this. Saved what? He asked, which sounded laughable in the emptiness. The figure did not reply in words. Instead, the imagery sharpened. A seed split in the dark. A line of notation wrapped itself around a bone. Someone sang, and their voice became visible, like colored smoke. The things the figure revealed were not grandiose pronouncements about humanity's origin. They were technical gestures, minute shifts, the wording of a notation that suggested a relationship between spine, breath, and a point in the forehead where a stone might be placed. Ray recognized the motifs, because his late-night notebooks were full of half-drawn diagrams that tried to render what could not be reduced, the meeting of attention and anatomy. The figure's presence arranged those diagrams into a choreography that seemed profoundly practical. He could have been hysterical. The rational part of him catalogued the reasons: fatigue, stress, the overreach of a scholar who reads pattern in cloud formations. He had a degree of self-suspicion that kept him from grandeur. But the part of him that had trusted patterns forever, who had read a weathered brick and heard a speech, responded like a leaf to rain. He practiced a small, non-technical inhalation, an unremarked drawing of breath, and as he did, the figure watched. Not the way a showman watches a performer, but the way someone watches a plant that is about to do what it is designed to do. The first activation was small and intimate. Ray's perception narrowed to the interior of his skull in a way he could not have described as private or public. It was simply the sight of a happening. He did not feel like a vessel being possessed. He felt like a radio finally tuned to an intended frequency. Images and textures came: salt near the edge of a mangrove, the rasp of a reed, the taste of lime in a child's mouth. And each one was accompanied by a clarity that made language extraneous. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes he felt a tremor of insight that dissolved as soon as he tried to hold it. It was, in the end, like trying to call a storm. He learned, somewhat shamefacedly, the two certainties that would define the path ahead. First, that the Codex offered protocols, performative scripts intended to be learned by bodies, not merely read by minds. And second, that the responses it elicited were variable. Sometimes people felt nothing at all. Sometimes a practice led to a lasting alteration. Less anxiety, different sleep patterns, minor perceived relief from chronic pains that had shadowed lives. But these were anecdotes, not proof, and Ray guarded them with a scholar's caution. Results varied, he wrote in the margins of his notebook, in a hand that had begun to wobble between excitement and fear. He also discovered, as all seekers do, that knowledge wants company. The discovery could not be contained in his own skin. The Codex's resonance hummed out like a new frequency, and those with ears tuned to it came forward. A woman from a remote university on the coast sent him a scanned rubbing of a similar spiral mark from a tomb she had been cataloging. An archaeologist working in private for collectors forwarded him a photocopy of a belt imprint, unearthed in a site that barely existed on maps. Each piece slid into the others with a cold inevitability. The pattern was global enough to imply lineage and specific enough to suggest an intention. Word, when it crept into the wrong ears, invited scrutiny. The department's more conservative members sniffed at Ray's performative hermeneutics as if it were a contagious idea that might loosen the discipline's seams. Funding interviews grew colder. A grant officer called his methodology dangerously speculative in a voice meant to close doors. In the margins of an email, someone used the phrase "forbidden codex" in a tone that was equal parts mockery and opportunistic headline. Ray learned to be careful with language because language flung into the public square becomes a weapon. Meanwhile, those who had themselves experienced some version of the response, an older woman with a chronic tremor, a philosophy student who had been looking for a way out of panic attacks, a retired tradesman who liked to say little but whose eyes had altered, gathered. They were not a cult. They were a small, anxious network stitched together by private messages, by grainy images posted in closed threads, by the kind of trust that comes from quiet testimony. Ray found himself at the center of an awkward hierarchy. He had the codex pieces and the uncanny opening. They had the lived evidence of incremental change. Together, they auditioned possibilities. And in the middle of this audible hush, Ray named the levels. M37 was the door, one that had been opened and through which a light had slipped. He scrolled MA Cent 114 in his notebook, like a promise for what might come next, an anticipation that felt like a higher pitch of the same chord. MA 203 hovered beyond that, enormous and disciplined. It was the thing that, whispered about, put a different kind of pressure on his chest. He knew, instinctively, and with a scientist's fear, that revealing MA 114 or MA 203 would change everything. The Codex did not forgive casual curiosity. There was also the question of the visitor. He did not name it as God or demon. He called it the observer. When people asked him what the figure wanted, his answer was the same. It did not want to lord knowledge like treasure. The figure had the measured attentiveness of a teacher who understood that instruction without consent was cruelty. At no point did it proffer easy assurances about the humanity's destiny. It offered practical gestures and an ethical subtext. Knowledge must be earned, shared responsibly, and never used to harm. Margaret's skepticism evolved in small, believable steps. First, she watched him from the kitchen doorway, simmering with concern. Then, after several weeks of small changes, he returned calls promptly, stopped forgetting the kettle on the hob, she allowed curiosity to move in. She did not witness the opening in his flat. She could not be there for every intimate transduction of perception. But she accepted an invitation to a closed meeting, where Ray demonstrated a small enactment of a notation in a controlled setting, a rhythmic inclination, a soft hum, a focus at the forehead that he insisted was only a cue, not an instrument. Margaret watched him perform and later said, without dramatics, "You seem less tangled." That, to Ray, was praise enough and permission. There were nights when fear braided itself into his work. If the Codex encoded activation, then who else might know? Histories whispered of suppression, collectors and institutions that had, in epochs past, been convinced such knowledge was dangerous. Ray kept thinking of hands folding the parchment and placing it in sealed chests. He thought of the way knowledge had always attracted the worst motives: empire, profit, spectacle. Responsible dissemination, which he had said aloud in sober tones to a small circle, began to feel like a moral imperative rather than a bureaucratic nicety. The opening had been an encounter. The real challenge, Ray realized, was learning to live with its consequences. He began to share, cautiously and ethically, with a handful of practitioners who signed non-disclosure covenants that were more about trust than law. They met in rooms with no cameras. No one in the group wanted viral fame. They practiced gently, if at all, focusing on presence rather than performance. Ray's notes multiplied, and with each small corroboration, an anecdotal easing of pain here, a night of rested sleep there, his conviction grew, but not his certainty. He kept insisting to anyone who would listen that this was anecdote, not evidence. That bodies are varied, and that a thing that worked for one person might not work for another. There were nights of triumph. A woman who could not stand for long managed a walk across a small yard without cramping. An old friend claimed a sense of diminished despair, and the tradesman who rarely spoke smiled once in a way that was not simple amusement but relief. There were also failures that stung. No change, brief euphoric sensations that dissolved the next day, and at least once a panic that returned with a force that made Ray's chest ache with responsibility. The group kept a ledger of effects and side effects, not as proof, but as care. They were careful to avoid hyperbole. Healing was a word they used with reluctance. Instead, they cataloged experiences, repeated them where possible, and wrote disclaimers on the margins of their notes. And somewhere beyond their small circle, someone else cataloged patterns too. Ray received an anonymous photograph of a carved stone in a remote ruin, spirals in relief, weathered but unmistakable. The caption read, ME114. The question mark in the email had the soft cruelty of a gauntlet thrown. He felt the old thrill, but also the precise cold of escalation. ME114 meant expansion. M203 was a landscape that would demand governance and ethic unlike anything he had imagined. The Codex's deeper levels were not meant for solitary scholars hunched over lamplight. They implied a social architecture, a way of teaching, and possibly a responsibility that included restraint. One evening, alone with his notes and the residue of the visitor's light humming somewhere behind his eyes, Ray understood something essential. The private opening had changed him. He now lived with the knowledge that there were techniques woven into human cultural artifacts that could shift perception, and that such techniques required a slow stewardship. He had tasted a connection to a tradition that was both technical and intimate. Encoded gestures, repeated attentions, the small, almost ridiculous labor of training a body. He had also tasted the danger, the way desire could oxidize into commodification. He folded his copy of ME37 carefully and placed it back on the saucer. In the thin hours between midnight and dawn, the world was a set of possibilities and the safety of a small, watchful network. He had been changed, and the change did not feel like the end of a story, but the beginning of a slow, communal work. Catalog, practice, test, care, and, if warranted, share with caution. There were still questions left like open wounds in his notebooks. Who had written the Codex in the first place? Why hide instructions as notation rather than as declarations? What did it mean that a non-human presence, an observer, was the one to open the Codex for him?
They listed possible effects: emotional disorientation, vivid recollection, temporary sensory shift. And they listed resources: a quiet room for recovery, Leela's willingness to perform debriefing interviews, and a local counselor who had agreed to take on anyone who felt more than discomfort. Money changed hands only to reimburse travel. No promises, no spectacle. It pleased Ray that the first volunteers were people he already respected. Anna, a photographer who had volunteered at a community archive, offered to be the first to touch the spiral in a controlled setting. She had hands that were always warm. "I can't promise anything," she told the group. "I can promise curiosity, and that I will say stop if I need to." The others signed. Ray read the consent form aloud and recorded the reading. Leela read aloud the physiological baseline, heart rate, blood pressure, notes on medication, previous mental health diagnoses. The room smelled, improbably, of citrus and old paper. They decided the flat would be a laboratory only in the sense that a laboratory tests in order to protect. It had to remain a domestic place, so the Codex could not be made into an altar. A saucer would cradle the spiral. A cloth would cover the saucer between sessions. The saucer would sit on a tray that could be transported if necessary. Ray insisted Margaret be present at every contact. He prepared an additional rule: no individual would be left alone with the artifact. Anna sat, wrists to her knees, and stared at the spiral as if it were a live animal. Leela taped a sensor to her finger. Jonah adjusted the lamp. Amir murmured a soft transliteration of the fragment's opening line, an old cadence that made the light in the room seem to settle. Silence arranged itself. "Start when you're ready," Ray said, because the Codex had taught him that readiness was not a private matter, but a mutual invitation. Anna lifted the cloth with both hands. The spiral lay like a small fossil of ink, coaxing but still. She placed her fingertips lightly on the rim of the saucer, not on the spiral itself. For a breath she said nothing. Then she rested her palm on the spiral as Ray had done the first night, and, an audible intake, her body shifted. "You're pale," Margaret said. Anna laughed quietly through the breath, a sound that could have been delight or apprehension. "It's like a pressure," she said, "at the base of my skull, like someone was asking me to remember how to breathe." Leela's screen traced a subtle rise in heart rate, then a steadier, shallower breathing pattern. Jonah's flashlight picked out a tiny smudge on the spiral's surface where a corner glinted differently under the lamp. Ray felt the spiral's pulse against his palm, not as a command, but as a rhythm that joined with the metallic tick of the monitor. She had a vision, they later defined it, an image, some scene that did not belong to her memory, but felt like a photograph taken of a different life.
Anna described standing in an old stone court beneath a sky of the color of old metal, hearing water spooning rhythmically into a basin. There was a hand, palm up, waiting. The hand smelled of smoke and lemon peel. She could not say if the court was ruined or simply empty. When she opened her eyes, she counted to 10, steadied her shoulders. "It wasn't mine," she said. "But it wasn't only not mine because I didn't grow up there. It felt older, like a place I'd been sent to test my hands." They recorded everything, as if meticulous transcription could turn experience into evidence. Notes filled margins, then pages. Margaret underlined phrases about smell. Silas wrote a headline summary about risk mitigation. Amir drew an alphabetic variant that matched a wedge of ink on the fragment. Jonah took photographs, while Leela advised a paced recovery and offered a glass of water. When the group dispersed that night, the fragment rested again in its saucer under the cloth. Ray kept a vigil that was less about waiting than about listening, to his own fast pulse, to the quiet shuffles of the building, to the chair as it settled under the weight of the evening. Anna texted a photograph of her hands on the ride home, thumbs whitened by a grip she later insisted was nothing more than the taxi's strap. Not every contact produced a vision. Some sessions felt like learning to listen to silence. An older man named Tomas, who worked part-time transcribing municipal records, the kind of job that made him tender to other people's paper, came and held the saucer at a respectful distance. He said he felt a warmth in his fingertips that percolated into the memory of his father's hands, and that was enough to make him cry briefly. Another volunteer, an engineering student named May, described nothing other than a peculiar light, a lateral flaring of color like the edge of a spectrum. Her recorder showed a slight fluctuation in electromagnetic noise at the moment she touched the glass, but the sensors were inexpensive, and Leela cautioned them against reading too much into a small spike. Against all restraint, word began to spread in a handful of quiet ways. A colleague of Anna's wrote about the archive's odd afternoons on a private forum. A former student of Margaret's called to ask if this was like the old stories of threshold objects that could be favored by cults. Ray shut his email for a day to preserve the group's deliberate smallness. They were not, they insisted, into the dark, a movement. They were a circle that wrote its minutes carefully. Then the desert message returned. Ibrahim's message was shorter this time and carried a tone Ray could not parse. ME114 has been waiting had been simple. The new note contained only a single pair of coordinates and 6 words. Bring witnesses, bring light, trust the ash. Attached was another photograph. This time the hand held the same slim strip of cloth wrapped tightly around what looked like charred bone.
Amir's map promised curves of parched land and a small cluster of buildings, a place whose plate-glass windows glittered like a mirage, and whose rooms smelled faintly of cleaning alcohol and old tea. Ibrahim met them in a courtyard beneath a sun-browned arch. He was thinner than Ray had imagined, and had the steady stare of someone who had spent many nights translating flat surfaces into meaning. "You came with witnesses," Ibrahim said without a greeting. He had a hand like paper, soft and slightly warm. "Good. Bring light." He smiled a little. "Trust the ash, too." They followed Ibrahim into a room where shelves were crammed with objects wrapped in worn cloth, ceramics cradled in box foam, linear drawings of characters pinned to a wire. Near the center of the room, a tray showed a narrow strip of ash-blackened cloth, a fossil of smoke. The photograph Ray had seen earlier was identical. Ibrahim's hands shook a little as he lifted it from its tray. "Found beneath a collapsed lintel," he said. "We called the layer M114 because it lies underneath a rubble seam dated to the 6th century. The collectors paid for the dig. The Institute cataloged what was found. Most of the pieces were mended and sold to patrons. This one had been overlooked." He set the strip on a table between them. Up close it smelled faintly of char and something else Ray could not name, an herbal scent like sage burned along a draft. Ibrahim told them in clipped phrases about a man who had first sent him photographs, a middleman in a border town who liked to sell fragments to those who believed in past thresholds. Ibrahim had asked for witnesses, he repeated. He had felt the strip wait like an animal in a burrow. They tested in the sterile, careful way scientists test things when they are more curious than confident. Leela unfurled paper sheets and placed electrodes that would never be as fine as the instrument racks in a hospital, but that could still offer data. Amir read aloud a phrase from the Codex, while Ray kept his palm near the fabric but not touching. The fabric vibrated under the tried light like a small animal. When Ibna, one of Ibrahim's assistants, brought a lamp near the cloth, a thin helix of ashlint seemed to flutter from its edge into the air and settle on the table. No one breathed at that moment. "It remembers fire," Ibrahim said, after a long, unspeaking minute. "It remembers where it roasted." "What if it's a trick?" Silas asked, a necessary voice. He suggested controlled air movements, spectroscopy on the char, a sample to be burned under laboratory conditions. Ibrahim demurred. "It is fragile," he said, "and the Institute does not want to destroy what little remains." He pressed his lips together. "There are things you cannot unmake." Ray watched the strip with a sympathy he could not explain. It was, in the end, only something like rag and carbon. Yet that night, in a low room lit by a dozen bulbs, it held the attention of 6 grown people as if it were a living tooth. They took turns laying a single finger near its edge and reporting sensations. Some felt a warmth, others the memory of water. One of Ibrahim's assistants said bluntly he had smelled smoke and heard a child's laughter. The results, like the codexes, did not arrange themselves into neat categories. They bled into one another like watercolors. At dusk, they left the Institute to sleep under the stars. Ray sat on the low wall of Ibrahim's courtyard and allowed the desert sky to widen above him into a frost of cold points.
Margaret placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You must remember to be a recorder, not an oracle," she said. "You must remember to take clear notes, to protect people, to set boundaries for the curiosity of others. You are not exceptional. You are responsible." Ray answered because the night's air asked for small confessions. "Sometimes I think the Codex has chosen for us," he said. "Sometimes I think it's only a mirror we keep seeing ourselves in." "Mirrors can cut," she said. "So can lenses. Keep them wrapped." They returned to the city with more questions. Ibrahim sent them a small parcel after they left, containing the burnt photograph, its edges more fragile in Ray's hands than he expected. Attached was a short note. "If you go to M114, go as witnesses. Bring light, literal light, and the kind that asks questions. Trust the ash. It keeps secrets, but sometimes it keeps the shape of memory." Back in the flat, Ray found the Codex's spiral waiting like a steady heart. The saucer had a ring of dust he'd not noticed before. He ran a fingertip along that ring and felt the residue like a whisper. In the days that followed, the circle expanded its methods. They instituted a registry of effects that tried to map descriptive language to sensory signatures. Anna's "hand that smelled of lemon peel" was filed next to Thomas's "father's hands" notation. Leela produced a spreadsheet that, flat and plain, tried to track the number of people who reported scent against those who reported sound. Silas wrote ethical footnotes that read like legal caution and like a prayer. At night, Ray began dreaming of ash. The dreams were never the same, but always they ended with the image of a small palm raised in welcome. In the waking hours, he found himself thinking of stewardship in terms he had not used before. Not ownership or control, but tending. He found he would sometimes wait with his hand over the spiral without purpose, as if presence alone might be a form of care. One morning, a message came not from Ibrahim, but from a woman named Sarah, who had been a colleague at the Desert Institute and had been the one to first insist on cataloging M114s. Her note was brief. "If you go deeper, do not go alone. There are watchers."